a foreign president calmly says his country may run another nation for years. Not weeks, not months, years. And what just happened in Venezuela is not merely a regime change. It is something far more unsettling. The capture of Nicolás Maduro did not close a chapter. It opened a long, uncertain occupation of power, oil, and legitimacy. The language is familiar: rebuilding, stability, freedom. But listen carefully, and you hear another word repeating beneath the surface: oil. Who controls it? Who sells it? Who decides the future built on top of it? If you want to understand how modern power really works, this is a moment worth watching closely. Stay with me. Share this if you believe global politics affects all of us. Because before we talk about the future of Venezuela, we need to be clear about what problem the United States says it is actually solving. And that takes us to the real question at the center of this story. Let's slow this moment down just slightly and name the problem as it is being framed. The United States says it intervened in Venezuela to remove a failed leader and stabilize a collapsing nation. That sounds simple, almost benevolent. But look closer. And the problem is not Maduro alone. It is who governs Venezuela now, and on what terms. After the raid, Washington did not hand power to the opposition that claims to have won the election. It recognized Delcy Rodríguez, a figure deeply embedded in the very system it helped remove. An interim government, yes, but one drawn from the old regime. At the same time, the US did something far more consequential. It asserted control over Venezuela's oil sales indefinitely, not as a temporary safeguard, as leverage. So the real issue is no longer regime change. It is management. Who oversees the transition? Who controls the revenue? Who decides when democracy resumes? This is where ideals collide with mechanics. Freedom is promised, but elections are postponed. Sovereignty is declared, but oil is extracted under supervision. And once a great power begins to oversee another country, history tells us one thing: the exit is never as clear as the entry. To understand how Venezuela reached this moment and why it feels eerily familiar, we need to look backward before we look ahead. To see how Venezuela arrived here, you have to step back from the raid, the statements, the headlines, and look at the system that was slowly hollowed out over time. Venezuela was not always a country defined by collapse. It was defined by abundance, oil, in extraordinary quantities. But abundance can be a trap. Years of mismanagement under Nicolás Maduro and before him turned oil from a blessing into a crutch. Production fell, infrastructure decayed, revenue became a political tool, not a national one. Then came sanctions. Designed to pressure the government, they instead accelerated the breakdown. Oil could not move freely. Money could not circulate. The state grew weaker and more repressive. This created a vicious cycle. Economic failure justified tighter control. Tighter control deepened economic failure. By the time of the disputed election, institutions were already compromised. The Electoral Council, the courts, the security apparatus. So when opposition tallies showed a landslide victory, independently verified, the system could not absorb it. The result was exile, hiding, prisons. What followed was not a sudden rupture, but an opening. A moment when an external power could step in and claim that only outside management could restart the machine. History shows us that when a country's economy collapses around a single resource, sovereignty becomes negotiable. And that sets the stage for the first true crisis of this new era. The first crisis did not explode with gunfire. It unfolded in silence. It was the moment the United States chose who Venezuela's future would wait for and who it would not. Many expected a swift pivot, the return of exiled leaders, a symbolic handover, a clean break. Instead, Washington recognized an interim leader drawn from the same political architecture it had just dismantled. Delcy Rodríguez stayed. The system stayed. Only the instructions changed. This was the real shock wave. At the same time, control over oil, Venezuela's lifeline, was centralized under US oversight. Sales, revenue, leverage, and suddenly the question was no longer who won the election. It became who controls the flow of money while elections wait. For the opposition, this felt like betrayal. For supporters of intervention, it felt like pragmatism. For the system itself, it was continuity disguised as transition. If you're trying to understand modern power, this is where you should pause. Moments like this define decades, not news cycles. If this analysis helps you see that more clearly, share it, because what looks like stability on the surface often hides something deeper underneath. And next, we need to examine the mechanism that makes this arrangement possible and sustainable. What keeps this arrangement alive is not ideology. It is design. At the center of it sits oil, not as a commodity, but as a control system. By overseeing Venezuela's oil sales indefinitely, the United States has inserted itself into the country's economic bloodstream. Revenue no longer flows freely. It is filtered, directed, conditioned. This creates a powerful mechanism. The interim government depends on access. Access depends on compliance. Compliance replaces legitimacy. You don't need tanks in the streets when you can regulate salaries, imports, and reconstruction through oil proceeds. Power becomes administrative, quiet, technocratic. Trump was unusually candid about this. Oil would be taken, oil would be used, oil would lower prices elsewhere and fund rebuilding here. But rebuilding, crucially, would take time. Time is the hidden variable. When a transition has no timetable, oversight becomes permanence by default. Elections are postponed in the name of readiness. Readiness is defined by those holding the leverage. This is how modern interventions differ from the past. They are open-ended by design, managed, not resolved. And once a system like this is in place, the next crisis does not come from confrontation, it comes from resistance. That resistance is already forming. The second crisis is louder, sharper, and far more dangerous. It begins not in Caracas, but in Washington. For the first time in this administration, the US Senate moved to curb presidential war powers. A narrow vote, largely symbolic, but symbolically explosive because it exposed something fragile beneath the surface. Consensus, interventions last only as long as political patience holds. And patience erodes when timelines stretch and clarity fades. Inside Venezuela, resistance takes a quieter form. Demands for political prisoners to be released, questions about why the legitimate president-elect remains in exile, anger that the same power structures remain intact, only supervised from abroad. Outside Venezuela, skepticism grows. Is this liberation or management? Is rebuilding a promise or a pretext? Trump speaks of profit, of oil-lowering prices, of deals yet to be made. But the more transactional the language becomes, the harder it is to sustain a moral narrative. This is the danger zone of any intervention. Not collapse, but drift. When purpose blurs, resistance multiplies. And when resistance multiplies, even the most carefully designed system begins to strain. Which brings us to the most important question of all, not about power, but about people. Because systems don't suffer, people do. If you are watching this from afar, it is easy to talk about oil, leverage, and strategy. But if you are Venezuelan, or if you imagine yourself living inside this moment, the story feels very different. You are not living in a transition. You are living in a pause. You wait for political prisoners to be released, knowing there are more than 800 people still behind bars. You wait for exiled leaders to return, unsure if they ever will. You wait for elections with no date, no guarantee, no clear referee, and every day you are told to be patient. That stability comes first. That rebuilding takes time. But time is not neutral when you are the one paying the cost. Oil revenues are discussed in distant rooms while ordinary lives remain frozen. The system that failed you before is still there, only now it answers to new instructions. If you are a citizen, you don't feel liberated. You feel suspended. This is where history becomes personal. And this is where it matters whether the world is watching. If this perspective helps you see the human side of power, share it. Because attention is sometimes the only leverage people have. And what happens inside Venezuela will not stay inside Venezuela. What unfolds in Venezuela does not stop at its borders. It never does. When a major power openly oversees another nation's resources, the signal travels fast. Allies watch. Rivals take notes. Regions recalibrate. For Latin America, this moment revives old memories. Intervention framed as stability. Oversight justified by collapse. Sovereignty delayed in the name of order. Governments across the region now face an uncomfortable question. If oil-rich Venezuela can be managed this way, who is next when crisis hits? Globally, the implications are just as sharp. Control over the world's largest proven oil reserves reshapes energy politics. It affects prices, negotiations, and leverage far beyond Caracas. And then there is the precedent, a model where democracy is postponed, not denied indefinitely, where elections are promised, not scheduled, where legitimacy is secondary to compliance. This is how global norms quietly change, not through declarations, but through repetition. Other powers are watching closely, learning what is possible when force, economics, and narrative align. And that brings us to the hardest part of this story. Not what is happening now, but what happens next, because the future of Venezuela will not follow a single path. It will split. From here, Venezuela's future fractures into three distinct paths. None of them are clean. All of them are plausible. The first is the optimistic scenario. U.S. oversight remains temporary. Oil revenues stabilize the economy. Political prisoners are released. Elections are scheduled, monitored, and respected. The interim government dissolves itself, as promised. Sovereignty is restored slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. This is the story intervention wants to tell. The second path is the middle one, and history suggests it is the most likely. Oversight lingers. Elections are delayed in the name of readiness. Oil flows, but power calcifies. The old system survives, updated to meet new expectations. Venezuela functions, but does not transform. Stability replaces freedom as the benchmark of success. The third path is the darkest. Resistance hardens. Legitimacy erodes further. Oversight becomes occupation in everything but name. What began as management turns into permanent dependency. In this scenario, no one truly wins. Not the people, not the interveners, not the system itself. History teaches us something uncomfortable. When transitions are engineered rather than earned, they rarely end on schedule, which is why this story cannot end with scenarios alone. It must end with a choice. And that choice is not only Venezuela's. There is a temptation when watching moments like this to treat them as distant dramas. Another country, another crisis, another promise of rebuilding. But Venezuela is not just a case study. It is a mirror. It shows us how power now operates in the world. Not through conquest, but through oversight. Not through annexation, but through management. Not through ideology, but through resources and time. Donald Trump said U.S. involvement could last years. He was being honest. The question is not whether Venezuela will be rebuilt. It is who decides what rebuilt means and when the job is considered done. Because freedom delayed is not always freedom denied, but it is always freedom redefined. If you want to keep following how this story unfolds and understand the forces shaping our world beyond the headlines, stay with me. Share this analysis. Watch the next video. History is not waiting, and neither should we.